Okay, Be'ezus Hashem, we will begin, and our learning is for Shalema, cousin of Steve Alter, um, and I'll mention his name after the shir. Um, so that's our learning for his recovery, and we're going to begin. We are holding Masechtas Zevachim Daf Yudalad, number 14. And let's just go review the Mishnah, which was on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, which said a following thing. The Mishnah said, and we've discussed this before, the Mishnah says that a korban can be disqualified if the person involved in doing the service of the korban thought about, let's say, that he's doing it for another korban. Let's say he's shechting a korban oil, and he says, "I'm shechting a korban shlamim." So he disqualifies the the korban in the sense that it's not total disqualification. It's just that the owner was not yotze his did not fulfill his obligation, has to bring a new korban. That we learned throughout this Masechta. The other point is that there's another way to disqualify a korban, is saying that I'm going to shech, to spray the blood, to do the zrika for another, for somebody else. Not for the owner of the bailam, not for the owner of the korban, but for some strange guy. So that's called a shinui bailim. The first one that we discussed was called shinu kodesh. The second one we're discussing is called shinu bailim, where you change when you do one of the services of korban, and you have a mind. And here's the difference: you have a mind that I'm going to do the zrika, the spraying of the blood on the mizbeach, on behalf of somebody else. So that is called a shinu bailim. Now we're discussing one more thing that you need to know. Another thing, and another thought that the Torah describes that can invalidate a korban. If you think about, let's say you're shechting a korban shlamim, and you're going to say out loud that I'm going to put away the meat to eat it in 2 weeks from now. So that's called shinui zman. You're changing the zman of when you can eat the korban. When you eat a korban, you have unlimited time from the day you shecht, the night after, and then the next day. But that's it. You can't say I'm saving the korban to eat it in 2 weeks from now. That passul a korban. Furthermore, that psul of a korban will render the meat that if someone eats such meat, he gets chayiv kares. And within thinking about the wrong halacha, if you also say that I'm having a mind when I'm shechting this korban that I'm going to eat this korban outside Jerusalem. So that's called chitzlum kaimai. That also invalidates the korban. And although the meat of the korban is not, if you eat it, you don't get kares. So that's called chutzlim kaimai. So those are the important things that you need to know. As we've seen this description before many times, this illustration is that there are four avodas, okay? There are four services. Where you first slaughter a korban, then you catch the blood of the korban, then that's called Kabbalah. Then you have Halacha, bringing it to the Mizbeach, and then you have Zrika, spraying the blood on the Mizbeach. Okay, those are the four services of a korban. Here you have a better picture of Zrika, of the korban. Okay, clear picture. And then you have the now we're discussing over here today is the concept of Halacha. Do you have to is that a necessary service that one of the four fundamental services of the korban? And therefore, if you have the wrong thought or you say it, you have the wrong thought, you passel the korban. Is that is halacha one of the main services? So our Tanakama, the whole Mishnah holds yes, because you slaughter the korban normally on the north side of the mizbeach, then you had to carry it to the mizbeach, right? Rav Shimon says not so fast, because it is possible, as you can see in the picture, that you can do the whole north of the Mizbeach is considered a valid place to shech. So one could technically shech the korban right at the back of the Mizbeach, as you see in the illustration. So therefore, halacha is not a necessary avodah. And therefore, according to Rav Shimon, any disqualified thoughts does not passel the korban by halacha, because halacha, carrying the blood to the mizbeach, is not a necessary procedure. So that's what the Mishnah says. According to the Kama, Shazevach Nifsal Barbod Devarim. There are four main services, according to the Tanakama, that could disqualify a carbon if you have the wrong thought. B'shchita, b'kibul, shechting. Kibul is catching the blood. V'hiluch, carrying the blood to the mizbeach. V'zrika, and sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. Rab Shimon is machshe b'hilach. Rab Shimon says, wait a second. Halacha is not is kosher even if you have a bad thought, because halacha, carrying the blood to the mizbeach, is a not necessary procedure, because it's possible to shecht the carbon right by the mizbeach, but it's impossible not to spray the blood. All the other service are fundamental. Hiluch is not so fundamental. So now we start our Gemara on Daf Yudal Raman Aleph. Now, here it's very appropriate to what we're going to have in Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, we have another service where you don't sprinkle the blood on the let's say on the mizbeach of the outside mizbeach, but you actually walk into the sanctuary and you sprinkle the blood on you don't sprinkle the blood, you actually dab the blood on, let's say, the paroiches, or the curtain, and the mizbeach hapnimi. There was an inner mizbeach, a ketoris mizbeach. So there, Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish. Rab Shimon ben Lakish made a comment. Moide Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon would agree. B'hailochas katois panimis, the carrying of the blood for a carbon chatas that had to be brought in the sanctuary. So let's see a picture of the sanctuary. Here's a picture of the sanctuary, and you had to bring the blood inside here. So if you go down, you actually slaughtered the blood. You slaughtered it. Here's a nice picture. You slaughtered the animal over here, right, by the carbon, and then you had to carry it into the sanctuary. Oh, so it's a necessary part of the service of a chatas penimid. Then a bad thought can disqualify even by an inner chatas. Hoyel, since va'avoida. It's a service that you can't get around it, because you can't shecht inside the sanctuary, because that's not appropriate. You only shecht in the azara. So you have to carry the blood. So carrying the blood is a fundamental part of the chatas panemius. Therefore, you could passel with a bad thought. Says the Gemara, so you're thinking passing bad thoughts happen by chatas panemius, right? That's the assumption over here. Says the Gemara, Rab Shimon says, Kol she'ena al mizbeach hachitzin kishlamim, any carbon that's not sprayed on the mizbeach, on the outside mizbeach, like a shlamim. In other words, any chatas that's not an unusual chatas, that's brought inside the sanctuary, as opposed to being sprayed on the outside mizbeach, ein chayovim alem pigul. There's no such a thing of a bad thought of eating the carbon, let's say, outside the normal time or outside the normal place. So we see bad thoughts do not passel a carbon panimi, a chatas panimi. Just like pigul doesn't work. So if you think shloi l'shmo is also not going to work by a chatas panimius. So how could Rab Shimon say at all that there's a problem if you have a bad thought by a chatas that's brought inside? It would seem to imply Rab Shimon holds that no bad thought can passel a chatas panemius. Answers the Gemara, Rab Yosef Rab Chanina, moida hoya lifsa b'kal v'choyma. Rab Shimon would agree that a chatas panemius, it won't become pigul, let's say, that if you eat it, you get chorus, but the carbon is disqualified. So even if the Kohen Gadol is shechting on Yom Kippur, a chatas, and he has to bring the blood inside the sanctuary, he could still have a bad thought to passel that carbon. It won't become pigul in the sense that if you eat that carbon, you get chorus, but it's still disqualified. And he has a kal v'chomer, it makes sense. A bad thought of the wrong carbon. Still, the carbon is kosher if it was a shlamim, but it would totally be disqualified if it was a regular chatas chitzoni. So chutz lizmanoi, if someone thinks, let's say, that he's going to eat the carbon outside its normal time, shepoisel b'shlamim, that right away passes a shlamim. So if I shech the shlamim and I say that I'm going to eat the shlamim next 2 weeks from now, the whole carbon is pasel. So ein din, certainly this concept of chutz lizmanei sheyifsel b'chatas should disqualify a carbon chatas, even if it's brought on the inside. Even if it's brought on the inside, it will disqualify the carbon chatas. So what Reb Shimon meant to say is that you're not chayiv mishum pigel, right? What he meant to say is by chatas panemius, you don't get chorus if you eat it, but nevertheless, the carbon is still disqualified. So bad thoughts could disqualify a chatas panemius, an inner chatas. Okay, so if a bad thought can disqualify, so then a bad thought about, let's say, shloi lishma, a bad thought on chatas panemius, if the kohen gadol thinks that I'm shechting an oila, or says he's shechting the oila, and really it's a chatas panemius, it will also be disqualified. So the Gemara says, "V'ashkachan." I understand chutz lizmanai, that if you can disqualify a chatas panemius by thinking the wrong time. Chutz l'mekayim minolan. How do I know I can disqualify a chatas panemius if I think I'm going to do something out of its normal place? Let's say I'm going to shech the chatas panemius. The kohen gadol shechs the chatas panemius and says, I'm going to sprinkle the blood outside the Beis Hamikdash. How do you know that disqualifies the chatas panemius? Are you going to learn it from chutz lizmanai that is possible by chatas panemius? Mal chutz lizmanai shekain kares. If you think chutz lizmanai is somehow a kares type of violation, because the carbon itself, when you eat it, you're violating it and you chayiv kares. If you disqualify chatas panemius by shechting it for not a chatas panemius, for a carbon oila, shekei noyeg b'bama, because shekei noyeg b'bama, because shloi lishma applies by a bama. Chutz l'mekaymai, this thing of eating it out of place does not apply by a bama. Very interesting that you can have a bad thought. There were times in Jewish in the Jewish history that people were allowed to have a mizbeach in their backyard. Prior to the building of the temple, during certain periods, you were allowed to have a little mizbeach in your backyard. You were allowed to bring your personal carbonos there, not a carbon chatas, but you were allowed to bring your personal carbonos, let's say an oila. So, but you can't disqualify a carbon over there thinking chutz l'mekaymai, I'm going to do it anywhere I want. I'm going to sprinkle the blood anywhere I want, because if you can do it in your backyard, you can do it you can make a bama in a public park. So there is no chutz l'mekaymai psula chutz l'mekaymai in a bama. So therefore, this thinking of chutz l'mekaymai is like a weaker type of psul. That's what the Gemara is trying to say. And therefore, if someone thinks chutz l'mekaymai, if the kohen gadol thinks chutz l'mekaymai by chatas panemius, how would I know, menolan, how do I know it would be possible? How do I know chutz l'mekaymai by chatas panemius would be possible? Answers the Gemara, shloi lishma b'ma noyeg. You learn it from shloi lishma. That's the bottom line. You learn it from a shloi lishma. Shloi lishma is by bama, but shloi lishma does not apply by Pesach Chatas. Pesach Chatas, but bama like karva. They didn't bring a Pesach Chatas by a bama, and therefore, just like therefore, chutz l'mekaymai would be possible by Chatas panemius, just like a shloi lishma would be possible by Chatas panemius. The Ibhayasem, if you want, I can say simple. Hekeshu, we have a hekesh. Shlishi zechutz l'zmanai, pigel zechutz l'mekaymai. There's the pasuk juxtaposes. Whenever chutz l'zmanai is a psul, chutz l'mekaymai is also a psul. Okay, so basically, let's just review what we just learned, and then we go on to the next sugya. What we just learned over here is, first of all, that Rab Shimon ben Lakish said that although by carbonos that are brought and sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, carrying the hoilocha is not necessary, and therefore a bad thought will not passel the carbon by a carbon that's brought on the outside mizbeach and sprinkled on the outside mizbeach, but a chatas panemius, that's the blood is brought into the sanctuary, there it was necessary to catch the blood, to carry the blood, and therefore hoilocha is a necessary avoider there, and therefore a bad thought would passel by halacha of achatas panemius, not only a bad thought of shloi lishma, but also a bad thought of chutz lizmanai, a bad thought of chutz l'mekayim would pass a carbon, albeit that a bad thought of chutz lizmanai, it would passel the carbon, but it's not doesn't become pigel, where if you would eat it, you would get carbs. But all bad thoughts would be able to passel achatas panemius by all types of avoidance, whether you shecht it, when you catch the blood, when the Kohen Gadol does the halacha, bringing it inside the sanctuary, and putting it on the curtains and the mizbeach, all that will passel a bad thought. Okay, now we go to the Gemara. Next Gemara, Amar Rava. Again, Rab Shimon is of the opinion that carrying the blood is not a necessary avoida, because you didn't have to do it. You could shecht very on the north of the mizbeach by chatas chitzoini. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava. Rava says, Intim Soloima. If it was possible to say, Rab Shimon Sovala Kebrei, that Rab Shimon holds like his son, the Amar, who said, Beinu Ulam LaMizbeach Sofoin, that between the vestibule and the sanctuary and the mizbeach is still considered a good place to shecht a chatas, even the inside chatas. Ein machshava mayals by lachas chatas means elam pasach ulam lefnem. In other words, here's the illustration. According to Rab Lezer, the son of Rab Shimon, technically, I could shecht the carbon very close up to the opening of the vestibule. Okay, the vestibule is this part of the where it is, right over here, this piece over here. I could check right at the door entering the sanctuary. If I could check over there, then halacha only has a limited area where it's necessary, walking through the vestibule, walking in the vestibule to the sanctuary. That will be the only possibility. Because Rab Shimon's son, he says you could shecht right up into the door of the vestibule. So therefore, halach is not necessary up until you have to walk from the vestibule into the sanctuary. Now we go on to another topic. If it was possible to say that Rab Shimon, whenever it's not necessary, Rab Shimon says it's not an avoida to passel a bad thought. So if it was possible to say, Sovelek Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar who said, Toicha Zara Mekadesh, Ein Machshava Mo'eles, by Halacha Silik Bezichen, Elam Pesach, Heicha V'Lekutz. There was on the Shulchan, let's say I have a picture of the Shulchan. On the picture of the Shulchan, you would see, that was the Shulchan. Once a week, they changed out the breads, the show breads, and they took the besamim, let's say, the voina that was on the table, and they were makter it on the mizbeach hachitzon. Once they were makter it, then the kahanim were allowed to eat the showbreads, the lechem aponim on Shabbos. Okay, so once they were makter of that. So now the point is that if Rab Shimon held that the bezichen could technically bring, you could have the mizbeach, you could mamish have the mizbeach right up until you could actually push the mizbeach over to the opening of the vestibule. Basically, you could makar of something over here. The mizbeach didn't have to be in that corner. So then, technically, at this point outside the vestibule, you were allowed to burn the incense. So therefore, what carrying did you need to do for that bezichen? For those incense that were on, technically you could put the shulchan right at the door of the sanctuary. So when you put it at the door of the sanctuary, all you needed to carry it through the vestibule. So that is the halacha considered of the bezichem, where a bad thought would passel. The imtim tzoloime, if you want to say toicha pesach kilifnim, if you want to say Sava Kedusas Heichav Ulam Chadahi, Ein Machshava Ma'elis, Elmi Pesach Ulam Bechutz. Fascinating. If you want to say that Rab Shimon held that the vestibule has the din like the sanctuary, technically you could bring the whole shulchan right up to the door. You could bring the shulchan right up to here's the shulchan, and you could bring it up to the psichas ha'ulam. I'm sorry, to the psichas of the ulam. I'm sorry, that you can bring it up to the sanctuary door. So the only time you need to carry it is just through the space of the sanctuary door, of the vestibule door, not the sanctuary door, because the sanctuary and the vestibule are one and the same, and the shulchan could be even in the vestibule. So therefore, then really the shulchan, all you need to carry the showbreads technically is just to the floor of the azara. So then there's no halacha unless that little space. If you're going to say that once you're in the door, in the door space of the vestibule, and you can see that in the picture over here. If you're in this door space, right, you consider it as if you're in the sanctuary. So basically, you just need to bring the bread. The necessary carrying the bread was just stick it out onto the floor, onto the steps, right? So therefore, all you need is to stick it out. So your whole halacha is just sticking the bezichin out to the floor. And if you don't move your feet, that's not called carrying something. Then, according to Rab Shimon, there was no possibility to disqualify the bezichin of the which is the spices of the shulchan. There would be no possibility to disqualify. Why? Let's say it again. Because technically, you could move the shulchan all the way up to the door of the vestibule. So you can move the shulchan really way up here. And once you could move it all the way up here, then technically there's really no carrying. There's no
I
necessary.
had to break the thing.
No, there's no carrying on the on the there's no necessary carrying for the bezichin, and therefore there's no halacha necessary for the bezichin, and therefore you can't passel it, because just sticking it out from the door and putting it on the floor is not considered carrying. It's not considered halacha, and therefore, according to Shimon, it would be impossible to passel the halacha of the bezichin with a bad thought. Let's go further. New sugya. Amalei abayla maroid Rav Chizda. Every Rav Chizda, he was a teacher, and he always had a loudspeaker, a guy who would broadcast Rav Chizda's shiurim. Okay, so Abaya told the loudspeaker of Rav Chizda, "Boy, Rav Chizda, please ask this question from Rav Chizda. Halacha bezah mahu." I guess this is a question according to Rab Shimon. Since Rab Shimon holds that halacha is not a necessary procedure on a regular carbon, so let's say a non-Yisrael does it. Mahu, what would be the din? Amalei, so Rab Chizda answer kashera, the carbon would still be kosher. Umikru misayenu, and I have a pasuk. Pasuk says in Divrei Yamim, "Vayishchatu es Pesach, vayizuk hakayim es adam yadam al v'yam afshitim." The pasuk says that non-Kohanim shechted the Pesach, and the Kahanim sprinkled the blood. It must be that the non-Kahanim carried the blood to the Kahanim who were standing by the Mizbeach, and the Kahanim sprinkled the blood. So we see that if a non-Kohen carries the blood to the Mizbeach, it doesn't passel the carbon. Says the Gemara, Masav Rav Shesha. Rav Shesha asked a question. We have a brisa that says the opposite. Zor, a non-Kohen, the Oinin, a Kohen that lost, that is an Ovel, let's say, Shikar, or drunk, Baal Mum, a Kohen that's, we go to Amid Beis, Baal Mum, who has a handicap, Bekabbalah, Bahilacha, Bezrika, Pasul. If they do any of these services, catching the blood, carrying the blood to the Mizbeach, sprinkling it on the Mizbeach, they disqualify the carbon. V'chein Yoshev, if you sit and sprinkle the blood on Mizbeach, or you carry the blood via sitting. I don't know how you carry it. We'll discuss that. V'chein small, if you use your left hand, if you carry it in your left hand, you passel. So we see, but the bottom line is a non-Kohen who carries the blood disqualifies the carbon. Tiyofta, this is a question against Rav Chizda. Says the Gemara, Rav Chizda Krakama, didn't Rav Chizda bring a posik to his side? Comma, and for the Gemara, the oven ma'ase itztaba. It does, that pasuk doesn't mean that the non-Kohanim carried the blood. Basically, a non-Kohen shechted the carbon. A Kohen caught the blood. A non-Kohen held the cup from the Kohen. So now he's just holding it like a piece of furniture. and the Kohen came to the non-Kohen and took it from him and brought it to the Mizbeach. So it was the Kohen that took it from the non-Kohen and brought it to the Mizbeach. So the halacha was actually done by a Kohen, and the non-Kohen was just acting like just holding it. So since he wasn't moving, he didn't passel the carbon. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Reb Yosef the Amri Tavayo, Rabbi Reb Yosef both held halacha bazar machlekes Reb Shimon Ravam. That if we get down to it, that would be a machlekes between Reb Shimon and Rabbanim. You see, again, Reb Shimon the Amma avodah she'efshel vat lav avodahi, a service that you don't is not necessary, like carrying the blood to the mizbeach, is not considered a service. So kasher bizarre. So then, according to Reb Shimon, since technically you could shecht right up to the mizbeach, so carrying the blood is not really a service. So therefore, non-kohen can do it. Rabbanan, they since the Torah discusses carrying the blood, it's considered a service. Psula, it would disqualify the carbon if it was done by a non-kohen. Amalei Abaya. So wait a second. What determines a service? If it could only be done as with a kohen. Amalei shchita da avoida is considered a service. Shiaf shlevatla, you can't get rid of shchita, and you have to slaughter the animal. Uksher bizarre, and it's kosher with a non-kohen. Amalei. So Rabbi Yosef both answered shchita lav avoidahi. Shchita is not an avoida also. Since it's kosher with a non-kohen, it's not considered a service. Says the Gemara, V'loi, it's not considered a service. V'ama Rav Zera Marav shchita para bazar pesula. If you shech the para duma with a non-kohen, it's possible. So we see slaughtering is a service. It must be done by a kohen. V'ama Rav Allah, Allah's of chukaksiv. It says it has to be done by a kohen. And it says Elazar did it, Elazar the Kohen did it. So we see that slaughtering is considered a fundamental service. Answers Gemara Shani Para Punner is different because the Koche Bedek Habayis, it's really not a carbon. The Paraduma wasn't the carbon. So therefore, the reason why is not because it's a service, it's a Gzeres Akasev. But if slaughtering a carbon, maybe that's not a service. Once you're in the base of Migdash and slaughtering a carbon, that's not a service. What's the proof it's not a service? Because you see, a non-kohen could do it. Says the Gemara, "V'lav kol decheni." Is that not a kolshkein? Koche beidebayis have avoided. Koche mizbeach lav avoided. Slaughtering on harazais in the paradum is considered a service, and koche mizbeach slaughtering in the base of Migdash is not considered a service. Things we find that things that are not in the base of Migdash needed a kohen, like checking out a nega. You needed a kohen, but certainly not a kachim service. So slaughtering the paraduma is not a kachim service. It was just exeris akasim. But perhaps slaughtering the base of Migdash is not considered avodah. The Gemara doesn't stand for that. Carrying the limbs to the ramp. The avoided the ashel vatlahi. There, the Torah, you don't have to carry the limbs to the mizbeach. You could actually undo the animal and set it up right by the mizbeach, so there's no carrying. Upsula bizarre, but nevertheless, carrying it from one part of the base of Migdash to another part of the base of Migdash to where the mizbeach is disqualified with a non-kohen. The ksiv v'hikra of a kohen hakoel v'hikra mizbecha. One kohen has to bring it to the ramp of the mizbeach, and then you put it on the mizbeach. V'amamar zu haylachas evar mekeves. That is carrying the limbs to the ramp. So the Gemara says, yeah, okay. Wherever carrying of limbs, the Torah says use a kohen. That's true. Wherever the Torah says you don't need a kohen, then really it's not on a service. Says the Gemara of Alav Kol Dechenhu. Wouldn't you make this obvious? Carrying the limbs to the ramp, which is not necessary because you could bring the whole animal and then on the ramp and do everything there. Still, the Torah says if you're going to carry it, use a kohen. If you don't bring the blood to the mizbeach, and therefore you're not going to sprinkle the blood, and it will hold up the whole kapara, the atonement, of course it's considered an avodah. So what the Gemara says, the Gemara doesn't understand. Even if you hold that it's not necessary to do halacha, according to Rav Shimon, it should not make it that a non-kohen if he does it, will not disqualify it. So that's where the Gemara concludes, and here we'll end. Amar Ula, Amar Ablaza. Haylacha bizar psula. A non-kohen carrying the blood after you slaughter it in a keli is disqualifies the carbon. Afilu Rab Shimon, even according to Rab Shimon, even though Rab Shimon says that if you think a bad thought during halacha, that doesn't disqualify, but having a non-kohen carry the blood, that would disqualify the carbon, even according to Rab Shimon, because it's still nevertheless considered a fundamental service to be disqualified a if a non-kohen carries it. So that's the point over here. If a non-kohen is carrying the blood, it's disqualified. If the kohen has a bad thought by carrying the blood, according to Rab Shimon, it would not disqualify. Okay, so that ends the share. Agutta.